It began, as so many Soviet mysteries did, with the maps. In the late 1950s, cartographers charting the Yamal Peninsula noticed something they could not explain: a ravine that had not been there before. A black scar split across the tundra, stretching for kilometers, wide enough to swallow rivers and villages whole. It appeared suddenly, first on aerial photographs, then in the memories of those who lived near it. Villagers claimed they had awoken one morning to find the ground divided, their homes cleaved by a gorge where the earth had been whole the night before. Livestock fell into it. Children vanished near its edges. The elders whispered it had no bottom, that when stones were thrown they made no sound of striking. The first reports were quietly suppressed. Local administrators were instructed to describe the divide as erosional misinterpretation, the result of poor surveying. But the ravine refused to vanish from memory. It cut through villages in Yamal like a wound, forcing relocations, severing supply lines, swallowing parts of the permafrost roads built at great expense. Entire settlements shifted around it, yet when central planners tried to reconcile reports with maps, they found contradictions. Some charts showed the ravine clearly, bold lines etched across the land. Others, issued the same year, showed nothing but flat tundra, a fissure that seemed to flicker in and out of existence depending on who held the pen. In 1961, a geological team was dispatched to the region. Their notes, preserved in fragments, describe a trench so vast and sudden that it seemed artificial. Sides unnaturally sheer, walls of permafrost cut smooth, like glass. The team attempted to descend with ropes, but their equipment failed. Compasses spun wildly, ropes frayed without cause. One geologist wrote in his diary, "The gorge is not earth, it is absence." Days later, he was found dead in his tent, his notebook half burned. The official cause, exposure. His remaining notes were confiscated, classified under the Ministry of Natural Resources. Meanwhile, villagers told darker stories. Hunters claimed they saw lights flickering deep within the ravine at night, like lanterns underwater. One woman swore she heard voices rising from the depths, chanting in a language she could not recognize. Children were warned never to go near it. But children are drawn to silence, and each year more disappeared. The state wrote them off as casualties of the tundra. The families knew otherwise. By the mid-1960s, the Yamal divide had become a forbidden phrase. To speak of it invited suspicion. Teachers instructed students that no such ravine existed. Maps of the region were reissued, the black scar erased, yet those who lived near it could not forget. They remembered their houses falling, their neighbors vanishing, the sound of the earth itself splitting in the night. They remembered standing on the edge of something that should not have been there, something that did not belong to land or sky. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the ravine was gone. By 1968, newer surveys showed nothing. Villagers who returned to their old sites found only tundra, unbroken and flat. Where once the gorge had yawned, there was now moss and permafrost. The divide had sealed itself, or had never existed at all. Officials declared the earlier reports cartographic errors. Files were closed. The name was forbidden. But among locals, a saying remained: "The land remembers, it will open again." In the early 1970s, whispers of the ravine returned, not from villagers this time, but from soldiers. Units stationed near Yamal, tasked with building infrastructure along the expanding gas fields, began filing strange reports. Supply convoys went missing without trace, their tracks leading to flat tundra and stopping as though swallowed. Men complained of sudden nausea and vertigo when approaching certain valleys. Maps produced in the field once again showed fissures, long black scars cutting across the land. Yet when aerial photographs were ordered, they revealed nothing but smooth expanses of permafrost. One internal memorandum dated 1972 describes an unexplained void encountered by a platoon constructing a pipeline. The ravine, they reported, stretched over 3 kilometers, its walls smooth as if carved with machines. Attempts to measure its depth failed. Ropes dropped into it never reached bottom, and radios lost signal after a few seconds. The commanding officer recommended halting construction. His recommendation was ignored. Within a week, half the unit deserted. The remaining men were reassigned to different postings, and their accounts erased from official files. Yet decades later, some of their letters surfaced, written to families in secret. One reads, "The earth was cut open like a wound, but no soil, no stones, no sound. Only cold air rising, like breath from something vast." Villagers nearby told stories of renewed activity. They spoke of hearing groans beneath the tundra, like metal shifting deep underground. Some claimed they saw the ground itself shiver, lines of frost cracking open for moments before closing again. An elder recalled seeing a line of reindeer vanish mid-step as they crossed a plain, as if the earth had folded beneath them. When search parties were sent, the animals were gone without tracks, without remains. The hunters whispered, "The ravine opens when it wants." Folklore intertwined with these disappearances. The Ninets people of Yamal revived an older myth of the black mouth of the tundra, a place where the underworld rose to the surface. Shamans spoke of a gorge that was not a gorge at all, but a threshold, a divide between the living and the dead. They warned outsiders not to follow the maps, for maps could lie, but the land never forgot. These stories spread quietly, carried from camp to camp, while the state worked harder than ever to suppress them. Yet suppression only made the phenomenon stranger. Engineers laying cables reported that their instruments failed whenever their paths crossed old coordinates of the ravine. Compasses spun, batteries drained, metal warped. Surveyors claimed their theodolites refracted light into triangular shapes when aimed toward certain points, as though the air itself bent around something invisible. One technician described feeling as if he were standing at the edge of a hole that wasn't there, staring into something that could not be seen but pressed against the skin. His report was stamped psychological disturbance and archived. KGB files from this period, now fragmentary, hint at deeper fears. In one intercepted communication, an officer wrote, "The divide is not geological, it is cartographic. It exists on maps before it exists in land." Another report suggests the ravine may have been used to relocate entire settlements during collectivization, the vanishing of villages explained away as the land itself consuming them. Whether this was metaphor or confession remains unclear, but in both cases the message is chilling. The Yamal divide was less a fissure in earth than a fissure in history itself, swallowing people and memory alike. By the mid-1970s, the ravine vanished again from official surveys. Gas pipelines stretched across the tundra unbroken. Villages resettled. But the silence it left behind was heavier than before. The land looked flat, empty, untouched, yet those who had stood on its edge carried a memory that could not be erased. A memory of a black gorge that opened without warning, split the world in two, and then closed again as though nothing had ever happened. By 1976, the Yamal divide had already been dismissed in official channels as myth, error, or superstition. Yet inside the restricted archives of Moscow, the files told a more disturbing story. A collection of reports, gathered under the innocuous heading Irregular Topography, Yamal Region, contained testimonies that stretched back decades. Surveyors, soldiers, geologists, men with no reason to invent, described the same impossible feature: a ravine that appeared suddenly, split the land with surgical precision, then vanished without trace. The pattern was unmistakable. Each time the divide returned, it left behind more disappearances, more silence. One report from 1977 stands out. A reconnaissance helicopter assigned to map a new road corridor flew over a barren plain near Salikard. The crew recorded in their log a deep trench cutting straight across the tundra, black and sheer, as though the earth itself had been cleaved. They circled for 15 minutes, filming with onboard cameras. When they landed, the film reels had fused together into warped black plastic as if exposed to extreme heat. The crew insisted the ravine was real. Their commanding officer called it mirage due to atmospheric inversion. But years later, one of the pilots told his son, "It was no mirage. The land was cut open like glass. I saw trees, whole trees, growing sideways from the walls, and beneath them, lights." Ground expeditions attempted to confirm these sightings, but failed each time. A team of geologists dispatched that same year found nothing unusual: flat tundra, permafrost, and moss. Yet their notebooks contain odd details: compasses spinning erratically, watches losing hours, photographs coming back fogged. One geologist scrawled in the margins of his notes, "It hides when we touch it. It does not want to be looked at." Days later, he suffered a breakdown and was flown back to Tiumen. His fate remains unclear. The villagers nearby were less surprised. They told the geologists the ravine had opened twice before, once in the 1930s and again in the late 1950s, each time swallowing livestock and entire sections of land. "It comes back," one old Nenets woman said. "It waits under the snow." When asked if she feared it, she replied only, "You fear what breathes. This does not breathe. It remembers." Her words were dismissed as folklore, but her grandchildren swore she had led them once to the edge of the divide, a black scar cutting through the tundra so deep they could not see the bottom. KGB field reports began to take the matter seriously. One classified memo in 1978 describes the divide as a cartographic anomaly with possible defense implications. The author notes that the feature appeared on some Soviet military maps, but not on others, often drawn by cartographers who had no knowledge of each other's work. More disturbing, in some cases, the ravine appeared on maps before any official report of its existence. A sentence in the file reads, "The divide exists first on paper, then in the land." The idea was too dangerous to pursue openly, yet copies of this memo circulated quietly, fueling whispers among the intelligence community that the ravine was less a natural fissure than a kind of wound in the fabric of reality itself. Disappearances accelerated. In 1979, a convoy transporting fuel across the tundra failed to reach its destination. Search teams found tire tracks leading to a flat plain where the vehicles should have continued, but the tracks ended abruptly as if the trucks had driven into the air. No wreckage, no bodies, no cargo was ever found. The incident was blamed on snowstorms, but an internal KGB note records the testimony of a rescue pilot who flew over the site days later. The ground had been split, a gorge where none should exist, but when we landed, there was nothing. Even scientists began to turn against the official narrative. A physicist stationed in Tyumen attempted to publish a paper suggesting that the Yamal divide was a temporal fissure, a phenomenon linked to fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field. He argued that the ravine might be less a physical feature than a rift in time-space itself, one that appeared sporadically and consumed anything caught in its geometry. His paper was rejected, his laboratory stripped of funding. He died in a car crash weeks later, though colleagues suspected the accident was staged. The manuscript vanished from his office, but photocopies leaked years later circulated in samizdat form. They contained diagrams of triangular chasms labeled with equations that made no sense, alongside a final note: "It is not a hole in the earth, it is a hole in the map." Locals began to treat the ravine as taboo ground. Travelers avoided certain coordinates. Herders steered clear of valleys said to hum at night. One fisherman recalled falling asleep by a frozen river and waking to find himself on the edge of a vast trench, black ice stretching down forever. He staggered back, and by morning the ravine was gone. When asked if he believed it had been a dream, he replied, "Dreams don't leave frost on your skin." By the dawn of the 1980s, the Yamal divide was officially erased once more. Maps were revised, aerial photographs retouched, eyewitnesses silenced. But the deeper the silence, the heavier the contradictions grew. the divide did not belong to geology nor to folklore alone. It belonged to the strange twilight of Soviet history, where denial was policy and the impossible was buried in red-stamped files. And still, those who had seen it could not forget. They carried the memory of a gorge that opened without warning, split villages, swallowed convoys, and then vanished, leaving only the unnerving certainty that the land itself was not stable, that under the tundra, something else waited to divide again. By 1980, the Yamal divide had become a shadow on every mapmaker's desk, a whisper that trailed every surveyor's report. Officially, it did not exist. In practice, its presence was impossible to erase. Too many stories, too many absences, too many files marked restricted circulation. Even in the silence of state archives, the divide seemed to breathe through contradictions. Some maps showed it clearly, black gashes across the white tundra. Others, drawn in the same month, showed nothing but flat earth. And yet both bore the same signatures, the same stamps of verification. Cartographers themselves began to doubt their work. One wrote privately, "I draw what is not there, but when I draw it, it appears." His letter never reached its recipient. It was during this period that the state began to treat the anomaly with a darker suspicion. If the ravine could appear and disappear at will, if it could swallow convoys, villages, and even whole survey teams, then it could not be natural. The military began to wonder if the fissure was a weapon, foreign or otherwise. Some officers speculated that NATO had developed a system to project false geography, to confuse maps and destroy infrastructure without firing a shot. Others suggested the divide was linked to seismic experiments in the permafrost, remnants of weapons research conducted in the 1950s. The truth was more elusive. A classified report from 1981 details the testimony of a geologist named Kudrin, who claimed to have witnessed the divide open like a mouth across a plain near Novi Port. He described hearing a deep resonance, like iron groaning under pressure, before the ground split silently in front of him. The trench was sheer, its walls smooth and glassy, descending into darkness without visible end. Kudrin dropped a flare into the abyss. It fell for nearly a full minute before vanishing into blackness. He insisted no sound ever came back. Days later, he disappeared on another survey. His belongings were returned to his family with no explanation. That same year, villagers reported a far more unsettling phenomenon. They claimed that when the ravine appeared, it did not merely cut the land, it cut through memory. Families swore they lost whole hours, sometimes entire days, whenever the gorge opened nearby. One woman recounted waking in her home to find her children gone, only to discover them playing outside at the ravine's edge. When she pulled them back, she realized the entire village clock had stopped, frozen at the hour the divide emerged. The children remembered nothing. "It steals time," she told investigators. Her testimony was filed, then struck out with the words, "folkloric contamination." Rumors of experiments began to swirl. In 1982, a special detachment of engineers established a temporary base near a site of repeated sightings. Their goal, to measure the depth and structure of the divide. Locals watched as helicopters ferried in drilling rigs, magnetic instruments, and floodlights. For a week the camp hummed with activity. Then one night, the tundra glowed faintly. Villagers swore they saw a black line cut across the horizon, illuminated by the aurora. By dawn, the base was silent. When trucks arrived to resupply, the camp was deserted. Tents stood intact, machines still running, food still warm, but the men were gone. In one tent, investigators found a single notebook filled with geometric sketches of triangles and repeating lines. The final page read, "It moved beneath us." Official denials grew harsher. State newspapers denounced rumors of the ravine as counter-revolutionary myth-making. Teachers told students that such stories were fabrications designed to distract from progress. Yet the harder the state pushed denial, the more vivid the accounts became. Soldiers stationed in Yamal spoke quietly of patrols that marched into the tundra and did not return. Hunters described hearing echoes that did not match their voices, as if someone else repeated their words from the gorge. Truckers muttered that roads once straight now twisted, pulling them toward coordinates that no longer appeared on official charts. The divide, it seemed, was not just a geological scar, but a distortion, a place where the rules of Earth faltered. Some scientists began to whisper that it was not a ravine at all, but a fold, a seam in the fabric of the land that occasionally slipped open. One physicist compared it to a page turning in a book. Sometimes two pages stick, then separate, leaving a glimpse of the space between. He never published those words, only shared them in a letter that survived in samizdat form. He was reassigned to Moscow and never returned to fieldwork. By 1984, the divide had taken on the qualities of a taboo. Villages near suspected sites refused to build, treating the ground as cursed. Elders warned children that the earth could open at any moment. In official documents, however, the fissure was only ever described as surveying discrepancies. Yet maps continued to betray the silence. In the archives of Tyumen, one set of military charts shows the divide splitting entire supply routes, drawn in thick black lines. Another set from the same year shows nothing. Both bear signatures of approval. Both were distributed to units in the field. When confronted with these contradictions, one cartographer told his colleague, "Sometimes the land demands to be drawn as it is, sometimes as it isn't." Weeks later, he drowned under mysterious circumstances while crossing a frozen river. The disappearances did not stop. They multiplied, and with each loss, the divide grew less like a myth and more like a truth too dangerous to name. It was not merely the land opening and closing. It was history itself, swallowing what it wanted, erasing evidence, and leaving behind only silence. By the late 1980s, whispers in Moscow began to call the Yamal divide something darker, Razlom Pamyati, the fracture of memory, a gorge that appeared not only on the tundra, but in the very act of remembering, splitting time, maps, villages, and people apart. And when it closed again, it sealed its victims inside forever. By 1985, the Yamal divide had already become one of those forbidden subjects that could not be spoken aloud in meetings, but could not be forgotten either. The archives swelled with contradictions, maps that disagreed with each other, reports that ended mid-sentence, witnesses reassigned or erased, yet the phenomenon refused to die. Every few years, the land itself seemed to open again, swallowing what it wanted before closing in silence. It was a cycle that no decree, no denial, no propaganda could halt. That year, a joint geological and military expedition was sent north of Salikard under the pretext of surveying for new gas reserves. In reality, their mission was to confirm once and for all whether the ravine existed. What they returned with only deepened the mystery. Surviving fragments of their notes describe arriving at coordinates marked on old maps and finding a gorge nearly 2 kilometers long, sheer and clean as though cut by an unseen blade. The sides shimmered faintly, not with moisture, but with a strange reflective quality, like ice but not cold. When they attempted to measure its depth with a laser rangefinder, the beam scattered instantly, refracted into geometric patterns on the gorge walls. Ropes lowered into the void frayed without cause, snapping after only a few meters. Then, on the third night, a storm rose without warning. The men heard groans in the earth, like steel beams bending, and when they rushed outside their tents, the divide was gone. By morning, the ground was unbroken, covered in snow. 2 members of the team were missing. Their names were never published. KGB memos from the same year reveal growing unease. One officer warned that the ravine was a breach of unknown classification and compared it to other unsolved anomalies. Tunguska, Dyatlov, the unexplained craters in Siberia. Another note insists the divide should not be described as geological at all, but cartographic, a feature that appears first in documents and only later in the land. In the margin of one heavily redacted file, a handwritten annotation survives. We are not mapping the Earth. We are mapping its memory. Villagers continued to tell their own stories, though each one carried the same unease. A Nenets herder recalled how his grandfather had warned him never to follow the sound of running water in the tundra at night, for the river may not be a river, and the ground may not be ground. A woman in Novi Port claimed that during a blizzard, she saw a ravine open directly through her village, splitting it in two. She described watching her neighbors across the divide, frozen in place, as though caught in a mirror. Then, as the wind cleared, the gorge was gone, and the houses were whole again. But those neighbors swore they remembered nothing. She insisted, "For 1 hour we lived in two different worlds." Her testimony was filed, then marked as folk hallucination. Industrial projects in the 1980s brought new witnesses. Workers laying gas pipelines reported entire segments of track vanishing overnight, replaced by untouched tundra. Bulldozers stalled inexplicably near certain valleys, their engines drained of power as though suffocated. A foreman later recounted that his men watched the ground tremble, crack open into a chasm, and then seal itself again in complete silence. "It was like the earth took a breath," he said, "and in that breath, half my men lost their courage forever." His report was buried. The foreman was reassigned to a project near the Urals. His crew dispersed. The most chilling account came in 1987, when a passenger train traveling along a supply route north of Nadim reported terrain collapse. Survivors described a night of strange lights across the horizon, followed by a shudder as if the train had hit a wall of air. Then the carriages ahead of them seemed to tilt and vanish, swallowed into the darkness. Rescue teams found no wreckage, no tracks, only a smooth stretch of snow. Yet records show that 47 passengers were never accounted for. The official explanation was derailment into river ice. But internal correspondence between investigators tells a different story. One commander wrote, "The land was not broken, it was divided. The train crossed into the ravine and did not return." His letter ends abruptly mid-sentence. As Glasnost loosened censorship, a few brave voices tried to publish what they knew. A journalist in Moscow assembled testimonies of the divide, interviewing retired pilots and engineers. His article draft, titled "The Fracture That Swallows Maps," described the ravine as a wound in the Soviet landscape, opening and closing with no regard for man. Before it went to print, he died in a house fire. The draft vanished. Colleagues were warned not to mention his work. But fragments of his interviews survived in samizdat form, passed in photocopied pages. In one, a retired officer recalls, "We did not fear NATO weapons. We feared our own land, because it opened without warning and erased what it wanted." The state, unable to explain, chose silence. Maps were redrawn, villages resettled, files locked away. Yet the tundra did not forget. Locals swore they still heard groans beneath the permafrost, vibrations that made dishes rattle and animals bolt in the night. Travelers claimed compasses spun near old coordinates. Hunters whispered that at times in the distance, they could see the ravine open briefly, glowing faintly with an inner light, before closing again with the dawn. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the Yamal divide had disappeared once more from official record. But the silence was deceptive. Beneath it, the memory of black gorges, lost convoys, erased villages, and vanished passengers continued to haunt. For those who had seen the ravine with their own eyes, there was no question of its existence. The only question was when it would open again, and whether next time it would close at all. The collapse of the Soviet Union did not bury the Yamal divide. If anything, the disappearance of strict censorship allowed fragments of testimony to leak into the open. Scattered articles, interviews with villagers, rumors whispered by retired officers who no longer feared the weight of Moscow's silence. Yet even in this newfound openness, the divide remained elusive. It was not a subject for newspapers or conferences. It was spoken of in bars after vodka, in villages huddled close to the tundra winds, in letters never intended for publication. And in every telling, the same contradiction emerged. The ravine was both there and not there, both mapped and erased, both seen and denied. In the early 1990s, a group of foreign oil contractors working near Nadam stumbled upon stories of the divide while speaking with locals. One elder told them that during the winter of 1989, the land had opened again for a single night, splitting a herd of reindeer in two. By morning, the animals in the gorge were gone, leaving only flat snow. The contractors laughed it off until their own surveying teams reported GPS devices failing, compasses spinning, and seismic equipment detecting hollow resonance beneath the ground. The data, they claimed, suggested a cavity stretching for kilometers, yet drilling revealed nothing but permafrost. The company withdrew quietly, citing financial impracticalities. Privately, one of the engineers wrote in a letter home, "It is as though the land refuses to be measured." Villagers, freed from fear of punishment, spoke more openly. In Salakard, old families remembered when the divide had cut directly through their grandparents' settlement, forcing evacuation. In Yarsalinsko, fishermen described nights when the ice cracked in a straight, perfect line across the river, black water gaping below, before sealing itself in silence. Children were warned never to chase the aurora across the tundra, for it lights the road to the ravine. One chilling tale came from a hunter who claimed that when the gorge appeared in 1993, he saw shapes moving within it, not falling bodies or animals, but figures walking, pale and distant, as though behind glass. When dawn came, the land was whole again, but he never returned to the tundra at night. Attempts at documentation continued. In 1994, a team of Russian journalists traveled to Yamal to investigate. They interviewed villagers, photographed strange triangular scorch marks in the permafrost, and collected maps that contradicted official surveys. Their article, published in a small regional paper, was seized within days. Copies vanished, the editors dismissed. One surviving fragment of their work describes the divide as a ravine of silence, visible only when the world forgets itself. None of the journalists pursued the story again. Even the new Russian state treated the subject cautiously. In 1996, a leaked memorandum from the Ministry of Natural Resources admitted inconsistencies in cartographic records of Yamal, but attributed them to legacy errors from Soviet surveys. Yet field engineers reported otherwise. They noted stretches of road that had to be rebuilt repeatedly, foundations that collapsed without cause, and strange zones where machinery lost power. A foreman on one such project confessed, "It is like building on the edge of something that isn't there until it decides to be." By the late 1990s, the divide had become a phantom that stalked both memory and land. Some believed it was geological, a permafrost collapse hidden by snow. Others whispered it was something older, a scar of the earth that appeared only when history demanded it. Retired soldiers hinted that Gulag convoys had vanished into it in the 1930s, their absence explained away as desertion. Locals muttered that the divide followed no natural law at all, but memory, that it opened where suffering was greatest, swallowing the remnants of what could not be spoken. And so the Yamal divide passed into the post-Soviet years as both legend and fact, resurfacing just often enough to remind those who lived near it that it was not gone. It was waiting, hidden beneath the tundra, flickering between map and memory. And every story ended with the same chilling certainty. The ground could open at any moment, and when it did, there would be no sound, no warning, only the silent split of the earth, and the knowledge that what was taken would never return. By the dawn of the 2000s, the Yamal divide was no longer the closely guarded secret of the Soviet state. Instead, it lingered like a half-forgotten scar across the tundra, a subject of rumor traded between oil workers, pilots, and villagers. Modern instruments, satellites, GPS trackers, digital surveys, should have erased all doubt. Yet the opposite happened. The more precise the technology became, the more contradictions emerged. One year, maps displayed an unmistakable fissure cutting across the permafrost. The next, the same satellite showed nothing but endless white plains. Engineers tasked with reconciling these images grew frustrated, calling the anomaly a shadow that moves faster than the lens. Locals still treated it as taboo. In Yamal villages, people spoke of winters when dogs refused to go near certain valleys, howling as if at an invisible predator. Truck drivers along the ice roads told of headlights bending oddly, refracting across invisible walls in the night, casting triangular shadows where no structures stood. One driver recalled his convoy halting in silence as the ground ahead seemed to drop away into a black canyon. When they advanced cautiously, the road was flat, untouched. He insisted that for minutes they had been staring into a gorge that wanted us to enter. His testimony was dismissed as exhaustion. Western researchers, emboldened by the post-Soviet openness, attempted expeditions. In 2002, a joint German-Russian team traveled to coordinates long associated with the Ravine. Their equipment recorded faint but consistent magnetic anomalies, as if something vast and metallic lay beneath the tundra. Then, on their fourth night, their instruments went dead. Batteries drained, compasses spun, and thermal cameras displayed only blank screens. The next morning, triangular cracks were found in the snow around their camp. One scientist later described waking to see the silhouette of a chasm stretching from horizon to horizon. "It was there," he whispered, "but not in the land, in the air." Within a year, he abandoned research entirely. Stories among villagers took a darker turn. Some claimed the divide was not only a gorge, but a mirror, reflecting what people most feared. Hunters said they saw dead relatives walking along the ravine's edge. Children whispered that when they threw stones into the abyss, the stones screamed before vanishing. A woman in Salicard swore that on certain nights, the gorge hummed like a machine, vibrating the windows of her home even though she lived kilometers away. Officials dismissed her as unstable, yet neighbors admitted they too had heard the humming. By the mid-2000s, silence returned. Government agencies stopped funding surveys. Journalists who pursued the anomaly found themselves ignored, their work unpublished, but the tundra remembered. Drivers, hunters, and herders still avoided unmarked patches of land. They claimed that the divide never vanished completely, that it remained beneath the snow like a scar hidden under skin, waiting for the right moment to open again. And always at the edges of these testimonies, the same uneasy truth crept in. The Yamal divide was not fading with time. If anything, it was learning to hide better, to erase itself more completely from records. It left behind no ruins, no debris, only memory. And memory, unlike maps, could not be redrawn. By the 2010s, the Yamal divide had slipped into a liminal space between folklore and forbidden science. It was no longer a matter of state policy, yet its presence continued to bleed into the edges of official records. Satellite archives revealed anomalies, lines of shadow bisecting the tundra for a single frame before vanishing in the next. Geological surveys returned with gaps in their data, stretches of territory marked as unsurveyable. When pressed, technicians admitted their instruments had functioned normally until they approached certain coordinates, whereupon everything, GPS, radio, even the faint hum of power in the circuits, died into silence. Oil companies, eager to expand into the resource-rich Yamal Peninsula, encountered the same silence. In 2012, a drilling crew reported that their machinery shuddered violently while operating near an unremarkable stretch of permafrost. The ground beneath them seemed to breathe, vibrating with a low pulse. Hours later, the drill collapsed into an unseen cavity. When the crew rushed to recover it, the cavity was gone. Only frozen soil remained. The incident was classified as a subsurface sinkhole, yet one worker, speaking anonymously years later, insisted, "It was no hole, it was a line, a divide. We stood on the edge of something not meant for us. Villagers revived older taboos. Hunters avoided valleys where compasses spun. Families whispered of winters when the ground split open briefly under the aurora, revealing black walls too smooth to be natural. Children claimed to see figures moving inside the gorge, as though another world pressed against theirs. In Yarsalinsko, elders described entire reindeer herds vanishing overnight. The land swallowed them, they said, but the snow showed no tracks. Even modern researchers could not escape the pull of the legend. A group of students from Novosibirsk University staged an expedition in 2015 determined to capture proof. They carried high-resolution cameras, drones, and digital recorders. Their field notes survive, though the students themselves did not return. The last entries describe a straight fissure of light opening across the tundra, glowing faintly despite the night sky. One wrote, "It is not Earth, it is mirror." Their tent was found weeks later, shredded but intact, with all equipment present. Every file on their hard drives was corrupted into a single repeating phrase, "Here again." Authorities blamed hypothermia. Families were forbidden to question. Rumors spread online. Satellite hobbyists shared images of dark lines in Yamal, claiming they were glimpses of the divide. Paranormal forums filled with theories that the ravine was a Soviet experiment gone wrong, that it was a wound in the Earth's crust, that it was an echo of Gulag graves. But none of the theories could explain the disappearances, the blank data, the silence. By the end of the decade, the Yamal divide was no closer to being explained. It remained what it had always been, a scar that appeared when it wanted, erased itself when threatened, and left behind only absences of animals, of machines, of people. And those who lived near it knew the truth outsiders refused to face. The ravine was not gone, it was only waiting, and when it returned, it would not open for minutes or hours. It would open until it had taken everything it required. By the 2020s, the Yamal divide had become both myth and warning. Officially, it no longer existed. Cartographic authorities erased all contradictory lines, presenting a seamless tundra. Energy companies published glossy reports claiming stability, safety, endless resource potential. Yet beneath these assurances, field workers, herders, and pilots continued to trade the same uneasy stories. The ravine had not vanished. It had simply grown quieter, more selective, appearing only to those who could not record it. Satellite analysts began to whisper about ghost coordinates, pixels that shifted inexplicably between scans, suggesting terrain features that were there one day and gone the next. Independent researchers claimed that weather patterns over Yamal betrayed the divide's presence. Localized storms, sudden lightning strikes, and spiraling winds seemed to cluster near certain sites. Drones deployed to investigate these anomalies returned corrupted footage or failed altogether, vanishing from radar as if they had entered an unseen corridor. One technician, reviewing a salvaged fragment, described a single frame showing a black line cleaving the snow, bordered by pale luminescence. The file crashed instantly afterward. In the villages, fear deepened. Hunters reported hearing low metallic groans beneath the ice, as though the tundra itself were straining against unseen pressure. Children claimed to see walls of glass shimmering across the horizon under the northern lights. Families spoke of nights when their houses rattled as though struck by invisible tremors, though no earthquakes were recorded. In Novi Port, an entire fishing party failed to return in 2021. Search teams found their sleds arranged neatly on flat ground, yet no sign of the men. The case was closed as severe weather exposure. But one rescuer admitted in private, the snow was unbroken, except for a single line that stretched until it disappeared into the white. Attempts to confront the phenomenon head-on ended in silence. A group of Moscow researchers, funded privately, set out to capture definitive proof. They brought ground-penetrating radar, satellite uplinks, and redundant recorders. For 2 days, they transmitted routine updates. On the third, the transmission ceased mid-sentence. Weeks later, a helicopter team discovered their camp abandoned. Equipment lay in place, powered down, batteries intact. But the researchers were gone. The only trace was a notebook page pinned to a tent wall, scrawled in haste, "The land is folding." Among locals, a new belief spread, that the divide was no longer bound to one location. It moved, selecting sites of its own choosing, erasing what it touched. Old men said it was hunting something. Younger voices claimed it was hunting us. Some believed the divide marked the threshold of another world, a parallel line of reality glimpsed only in brief fractures. Others whispered that it was the memory of every secret burial, every erased crime, every unmarked grave of the Gulag years. "The earth remembers," one elder said, "and sometimes it opens to remind us." Yet for every whispered testimony, there was official denial. Rosgeo published reports dismissing the divide as regional myth. Local governors laughed off questions, insisting Yamal's only mysteries were the price of gas. But silence, like the tundra itself, has weight. Too many files had vanished, too many expeditions had failed, too many names had been erased. The ravine's absence had become its most damning evidence. And so, by the second decade of the century, the Yamal divide persisted. Not on maps, not in public record, but in the eyes of those who had stood at its edge, staring into an abyss that had no bottom, only reflection. They knew the truth others ignored, that the divide was patient. It had appeared before, it would appear again, and when it did, it would not ask permission. It would open, it would take, and it would close, leaving behind nothing but the silence of snow. In the years that followed, the Yamal divide ceased to be an event and became an atmosphere, an unspoken certainty that the land itself was unstable, holding secrets that no surveyor, no satellite, no archive could lock away. For outsiders, it was a ghost story told by oil workers, a curiosity for fringe researchers, a forgotten Soviet rumor recycled in online forums. But for those who lived near the tundra, it was a presence. They did not ask whether it was real. They asked only when it would return. Whispers grew that the divide had changed. Where once it was a singular ravine that appeared and vanished, it now seemed to manifest in subtler ways. Drivers on frozen roads described headlights bending unnaturally, as if refracted through invisible glass. Pilots reported flashes of light below them that looked like gorges reflecting the aurora, though no such formations existed on the ground. Some villagers swore that on certain nights, the earth itself seemed to breathe, snow shifting gently as though covering a chest rising and falling beneath. Leaked fragments of post-Soviet files hinted that the authorities had not abandoned their watch. An anonymous document circulated online in 2018, stamped with the faded insignia of the FSB. It contained seismic readings that spiked without cause, centered on sites long associated with the divide. The document concluded with a phrase circled in red ink: "Cartographic interference consistent." If genuine, it confirmed what locals had always known. The divide was not geological. It was a phenomenon that rewrote the land according to its own logic, appearing on maps before it appeared in the tundra, erasing itself from paper before it closed in soil. By the early 2020s, the mystery had grown darker still. A team of independent researchers released drone footage showing a straight shadow cutting across the snow, several kilometers long. In the next frame, the shadow was gone. The researchers disappeared soon after releasing the video. Their equipment was recovered from a warehouse in Tyumen, stripped of all data. The official story was that they had drowned during an unrelated expedition. Yet villagers said they had last been seen driving north, toward coordinates whispered in local lore. Among the Nenets, the divide became folded into legend. Elders told children that it was a line drawn by the gods, separating the living from the forgotten. Cross it, they warned, and you would belong to neither side. Younger generations spoke of it differently, as if it were alive, waiting under the snow for the weight of human footsteps. One chilling tale spread through the villages, of a man who followed his own shadow one winter night, only to find it leading into a gorge that was not there. He was never seen again. And so, the Yamal divide remains, neither confirmed nor disproven, neither myth nor fact. It lingers in the collective memory like a scar too deep to fade. Perhaps it was born from Gulag deaths, or from Soviet experiments lost to secrecy. Perhaps it is older still, a wound in the earth that predates humanity. Whatever its origin, its silence endures. The tundra is vast, and silence is its language. The final question is the one no one dares answer. Did the Soviet Union truly erase a phenomenon from maps, or did the maps merely reveal something that could never be contained? Was the Yamal divide a mistake of geology, a Soviet cover-up, or something far more alien, an intersection of worlds we were never meant to walk upon? No archive will give the truth. No testimony will ever be complete. All that remains is the certainty whispered by those who have lived in its shadow that one day, without warning, the land will open again, and when it does, it may not close.